Thank you for tuning in to another episode in range. This was supposed to be the September 2019 Q&A, but due to a failed mission to Fury 161, it got delayed to October, and I apologize to you for that, but finally getting to it today in October, and we will get back on track next month. So there are always a lot of questions here. They're provided by our Patreon supporters. If you don't realize this, In Range is completely a Patreon supported project. It's only you, the viewer, that fund this channel. There's no advertising money or sponsors at all whatsoever. So while we deal with this infection that's coming from Fury 161, let's go ahead and get through these questions before something else worse happens. Trystan R. What are your thoughts on polymer-cased ammo such as True Velocity? Well, you know, it's interesting. I haven't used the most modern iterations of polymer-cased ammo. I messed with this stuff quite a few years ago, actually, before In Range was even a thing. And the stuff that was out there, and I don't remember if it was True Velocity or who made it, but it actually worked really well. I had no issues with it whatsoever. It was reliable, it was accurate, and it was light to carry, which is exactly the reason to have polymer-cased ammunition. However, in larger testing samples, things that did not occur to me, I heard about case head separations and other issues that caused malfunctions. Case head separations, of course, being a pretty catastrophic failure. As well as one of the things that's interesting in large round count or high volume of fire, such as a fully automatic gun, is that polymer is not the heatsink that a brass case is when it's extracted and ejected from the firearm. So you have a problem with guns overheating with polymer-cased ammunition, at least in high round count. So I don't know how you'll ever address that particular issue, but my experience with polymer-cased ammo for my applications, which are generally lower round count, is that it's been really good and exceptional, and I would actually like to have more of it for things like Desert Brutality, which would be really cool. So maybe we'll see more of that on In Range TV, and maybe we'll see some more developments with polymer-cased ammunition in the near future. But I think it's an interesting thing, and hopefully we'll see that technology evolve. Craig S. Jr. Karl, what's the difference in gear? Not the guns themselves, but rather say the accessories and web gear with three gun and two gun. Well, one of the obvious things is three gun has three guns, and one of those three guns is a shotgun. And that shotgun is something that's very unwieldy in terms of what the gear is that you have to carry around it for accessories and ammunition storage. So you'll see things like bandoliers, belts. In three gun, though, you'll traditionally see now these load two or these caddies that hold 4 or 5 shells or 6 shells, and you pull them out in quantities of 2 or 3 and then use this magical way to like shove them all into the magazine. And really what the big difference is there is that having the accessories and necessary gear to be able to run that third gun of the shotgun is really a challenge to fit it on your gear, and it has no real practical world application outside of three gun. Additionally, the shotgun, even if you go with a magazine-fed shotgun, are extremely bulky and unwieldy, and when you try to combine that with your rifle and your pistol and everything else, it becomes a problem. Lastly, I'd say the biggest difference besides that is that the stuff in two-gun, at least what we call two-gun action challenge match, and Desert Brutality matches, etc., is that we are very physically oriented compared to a lot of three-gun, which is not that so much. Three-gun typically is moved from box A to box B to box C. It's not things like crawl through this mud pit over a wall under a car and therefore have to retain all of your gear in the process. And so, for example, holsters that are completely viable at three-gun are completely impractical at two-gun because you'll lose your pistol within the first 30 seconds of a stage, and that's, of course, a DQable offense. So I would say that, and this is not meant as a positive or a negative, I would say that the gear that's used in two-gun, at least two-gun action challenge match and Desert Brutality, is more practically oriented as field gear, and three-gun gear is more specialized towards competition, typically speaking. Carol K. What makes a gun too precious to shoot? Well, I don't typically want to own guns that are too precious to shoot, so this isn't necessarily my thing. However, there has been a couple in my collection, or have been, I should say, that have fallen into this category. The most recent one was when I possessed or was able to acquire a Gewehr 41. The Gewehr 41 being the bang system-like gas system semi-automatic rifle from the German side of World War II, their first widely adopted semi-automatic and 8mm Mauser, which then evolved into the G43, which is a short-stroke gas system, piston system. But the G41 was made in relatively small numbers, was not well liked in the field, and was hard to maintain, especially in the environment of the Eastern Front, and the loss numbers of it on the Eastern Front were just extraordinary. And therefore, the ones that exist today are either beat to heck, or they are all matching and were taken extremely well care of and are really museum quality guns. And I like to use my guns like you see in Two Gun, where we kind of run and gun and do pretty brutal things and crawl through the dirt and all that kind of stuff. And in the process of doing that, we tend to scratch them up and kind of beat them up in a way that they would have been beat up in the field. And the G41 that I had my hands on was really museum quality grade in terms of quality and value, in terms of its value on the market. And I just didn't want to abuse that gun. So for me, that was too precious to shoot. Now, someone else might feel otherwise. But I would say that the biggest reasons for something being too precious to shoot are the general value of it on market value. Market value is too extreme. Putting wear and tear on it may not make financial sense. Secondarily, if a gun is something that was made in very small quantities and therefore replacement parts are essentially unobtainium or would have to be machined by a qualified machinist if you could find one to make a part, that's a concern, especially if it's something that's known to have breakage issues. And the last one is if something is specifically tied to a specific historical event or person, that's probably not a good idea to shoot that either. Generally speaking though, if something is in that category of it's going to break and I can't fix it, or it's just too expensive to put wear and tear on it, or it's tied to a very specific historical event or person, chances are I won't be shooting it. And I would advise others not to as well, because they are, at that point, truly legitimate pieces of history. One of the things we see on in-range is when we do a mud test on like an M1 Garand, people are like, I can't believe you did that to that piece of history. And I find that kind of ridiculous, because M1 Garands were made in the millions. They were the U.S. Army's standard issue rifle from 1936 until the late 1950s, and were used even beyond that. So, and I might have those dates slightly wrong, guys, but you know what I mean. Decades of use, millions of them produced. They went through World War II, they went through Korea, they went through Vietnam. Dunking that in the mud is certainly not a concern. That's a battle rifle that's been through much more than that event. And that's an example of something that is not too precious to shoot. But the G41 that I described earlier kind of is. PHILLIP W. For tuning the action of a DI AR-15, one can use adjustable gas block, change the mass of the bolt carrier buffer, or change spring rate of the buffer spring. What method do you suggest for getting the lowest recoil impulse? Well, really, if you want the absolute possibly lowest recoil impulse, you're probably going to want to do all of them. But I am not a proponent of all of them. In fact, when you're trying to get the lowest recoil impulse, I want you to realize that you're going inverse to the goals of the design as AR-15, the way it's designed, which is reliability. So you are inducing potential problems in the process of doing this. But that said, if you're accepting that risk, the last thing I would do is add an adjustable gas block. I think one of the things the DI AR-15 brings to the table is something that's very reliable without having an adjustable gas system. And I find adjustable gas systems usually to be more problem than benefit. So in my opinion, what I would go with, if you're trying to lower the recoil impulse with the understanding that you're necessarily messing with the reliability, would be to go with low mass bolt carrier, a heavy buffer, and a heavy spring. And once you get the right combination of heavy buffer and heavy spring weight in association with your light or low mass carrier, you will definitely reduce the recoil impulse. I've experienced it, it works. It's not something I recommend for a practical gun, but that's the way I would go about it. Sean S. What do you think of the DERPGRU phenomena? So for those of you that don't know, InRange has a Patreon perk, which is a Discord access, and we have this really vibrant community that's formed there of people that are talking on it really 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's really a lot of fun. You get on there and there's people goofing off, there's people talking about serious gear, there's people talking about current events, everything possibly you could think of that someone that might watch InRange is interested in. They're talking about it on the Discord. And DERPGRU is a group of people who have formed some patches, and they make patches for matches they go to, and they're kind of the competition shooting, recurring competition shooting element of the Discord Patreon supporters. And I think it's awesome, because when I created the Discord for InRange, I thought it was a cool Patreon perk, but I did not expect it to necessarily become the really awesome phenomena that it has of being a place where people have formed a community. We have people making friendships, attending matches together, having a lot of fun. So, Sean, I think the DERPGRU thing is freaking awesome. And I like the fact that we're shooting very hard matches, but not taking ourselves too seriously in the process. And that's the way I think it should be. Kris with a K. Well, good job, Kris. I'm Karl with a K, and everyone gets that wrong, don't they? Being a content creator, having to spend time on social media platforms, how do you manage the negativity that comes with said platforms? Yeah, you know, that's unfortunate. It's the reality of the internet, isn't it? It's not just social media, YouTube. Really, the whole internet has become a place where, unfortunately, it seems like more often than not, I don't know if this is the nature of us as humans where we focus on the negative, or the negative is getting more, is of higher volume, but there is a lot of negativity. And I find it interesting in that, for myself at least, if there's something on the internet that I come across, like let's say there's a YouTube channel that's got 3 million subscribers, and I go to watch the content and I don't like it. You know what I do? I just don't watch it. I go on to some other channel and move on with my life, and hopefully that person's successful and their audience enjoys their work and they enjoy creating that work. I don't know what the purpose is of leaving some sort of hate mail behind for them. And or even if they have a different view in the world or a different opinion, the internet should be a world of divergent ideas and opinions. And one of the things that the internet, at least still maybe in 2019, democratizes is the ability of most people to have a voice that they wouldn't have had otherwise in world conversations. And it is therefore important for us to allow them to exist, and to go there and spread negativity with them has no value. Now, if they're doing something dangerous or insipid, that's something that should be probably engaged. But the reality is that just general negativity that the internet seems to foster from people, frankly, I think that comes from people that are probably not in a good place, and it's sad. And I'm empathetic to them, and I hope they find a better way to channel those negative energies into something positive in their life, because posting just random hate mail on the internet does nothing for anyone. It just drags everyone down. So that's my thoughts on it. There is a nerdcore rapper who I really enjoy, and he has a song recently that's come out that's called "The Internet Sucks," and he talks about how he used to be in love with the internet, and now he's no longer in love with it because of these reasons. And it's discouraging and sad. I'll put a link to that at the end of this video for you guys to check it out. Bums me out, but his work's really good, and his most recent album is excellent. So, Eamon B. Do you ever have issues with stuff mounted on guns, such as lasers and lights, getting hung up on firing ports, such as VTAC barricades? And if so, do you ever take them off for competition? Yeah, this is a real thing. It's funny that things that you use in practical applications or in military applications, like an IR laser system, really can mess with you when you're trying to fire through a VTAC barricade. You need to learn how to navigate around that. So therefore, if your goal is to learn how to use your practically oriented rifle, and the match is an environment for you to do that, then I would recommend not taking them off for the competition and just dealing with the fact that you're dealing with that problem. If your goal is to have the best score and not necessarily practice with your practical gun, then by all means take it off. This most memorably happened to me at one of the Red Octobers, in which I had that ridiculously overweight Zenitco configured AK, and I had a laser unit on it, a Russian laser unit, and we had this extremely low port to shoot under in one of the stages, and I could not get a firing solution under that, and it cost me dearly. And one of the reasons was the laser unit was in the way. And so I didn't take it off, I just dealt with it. Sucks, but it was a lesson learned. So yes, it happens. It's a real thing. Maybe learn, if one of the things you can learn from these environments is to configure these things so that maybe they're less invasive. But it does happen, and I would recommend leaving them on there if you wish to have them on the gun, so that you can actually experience what it's like to use that in a practical environment. Karl V. Are there any plans to increase the amount of shooters in the next Finnish Brutality so more people can join this awesome experience? Yes, there are. We are talking already about the next Finnish Brutality 2020. And one of the things, and one of the goals, is to increase the attendance to a higher number. So this year we already got Desert Brutality 2020, the one here. It's going to be in Chino Valley, Arizona in late January, early February. Stay tuned for that. Currently, Patreon supporters are getting early access to the registration, but that will go public, I believe, on November 18th, if you're not a Patreon supporter. We are planning to get a large number of people into that, somewhere around 200. And at Finnish Brutality, I think we had 85. And part of that, the reason for that, is because Jari's very, one of his biggest goals is to make it run as smoothly as possible. And large volumes of shooters make that more difficult. Plus, the range facility we're at in Finland doesn't necessarily facilitate towards such a large volume of shooters. But one of the goals for next year is absolutely to increase the volume, at least a little bit, maybe to 100 or more, so we can get more people in the match. Finnish Brutality 2019, in my opinion, was the coolest, most fun match I've ever shot anywhere, even more so than Desert Brutality. But We're going to try and make Desert Brutality 2020 match up to the Finnish Brutality 2019 experience. Jon H. The M1 carbine has a reputation for being unreliable. What was wrong with it? Design flaw? Ammunition? Unrealistic expectations? Well, I'm going to say I don't know that it has a recommendation for being unreliable. That's something I've talked about here on In Range, and I've heard a lot of other people say otherwise. I got to tell you, though, my experience for 20 years of my shooting career has been that I cannot find an M1 carbine that has been reliable. I'm serious. The closest I ever got was a commercial universal that was built well after the war, and that one was pretty good. But of all the mil-spec USGI M1 carbines I've used, I have never had one fit what I would call the definition of reliable. And I'm going to go ahead and compare it to the M1 Garand, which in my opinion is reliable and the same gun from the same period of time. So people say, well, you got to get the right magazines, you got to do this with the springs, you got to do this, you got to do that. And I had an experiment a while back where I got an M1, replaced every spring on it, got brand new in the wrapper USGI World War II surplus mags and Korean mags, and got multiple brands of ammunition, and I could not get the gun to be reliable. I give up. And I really did. I give up. I'm not playing with those. I'm not messing with the M1 anymore, not the carbine. And we always see in the comments, well, someone says this or that, or Ian did an interview with Ken Hackathorn on Forgotten Weapons where he talked about it being this wonderful, reliable weapon. And I don't know what to say to that beyond that my experience does not bode that out. And I think what we see, in my opinion, what we see with the M1 carbine was it was a very handy, light, reliable enough gun for the people that it was generally issued to, which was generally speaking not frontline soldiers fighting. It was generally mortar crews or tanks or, you know, transports, people that it would replace their pistol, which was the original idea, was to replace the 1911 with a gun they could be more accurate with. And if you're on a mortar crew and you don't fall in the mud with the thing and you need to defend yourself against a Japanese soldier that's coming up on the mortar position and you fire your one magazine of 15 rounds and it worked and it saved your life, you're going to think very highly of that gun. And I think a lot of the narrative around the M1 carbine are incidentals where it was carried a lot, shot a little. And I know there are exceptions, I understand that, but I think that's where that comes from. As to what is causing the reliability issues, in my opinion, I think it's twofold. I think the magazines were not a great design, and I think that gas system is flawed. I don't think it has quite enough energy to keep that system running, and as well as exposed operating surfaces, just like the M1 Garand, but that's another issue in a smaller gun. The M1 Garand has 30-06 in its working in its favor to cycle that system, and of course the 30 carbine has 30 carbine, which is far less power, and therefore even though the operating systems in terms of the dual rotating locking lug bolt and the op rod are similar, there's a lot more energy in the M1 Garand to the carbine. I think that's what you're dealing with. Jon B. On the AR-15 platform, can you give us an idea of the loss of accuracy from having a traditionally pinned up front sight base gas block versus a free-floating handguard setup? Could you characterize it in percent of MOA loss? Ron, I don't take this the wrong way. This really has nothing to do with minute of angle accuracy of the mechanical accuracy of the gun. A free float tube allows you to apply pressure to the tube with a bipod or when resting on a table or a rock or a tree and not impinging upon the zero or the harmonics of the barrel because you're applying weight to the float tube and not the barrel itself. So you could have a properly pinned front A-frame gas system and front sight with a free float tube, and that pinned, whether pinned or not, doesn't have any impact on the accuracy of the gun or the MOA of the gun. You can have a non-free floated AR that if you handle it properly, it will not affect the minute of accuracy of the gun. It will shoot the same size groups. But if you, for example, tie up with a really tight sling like we do in NRA high power, you may very well shift your impact as a right-handed shooter, shift the impact low and left because of putting pressure on the sling swivel attached to the front A-frame and front sight. If that same sling mount swivel was on a free float tube and you slung up with the same amount and tension, you would have the same mechanical accuracy in terms of group size, but because you're applying pressure to the free float tube and not the actual barrel causing it to flex, you would not modify your zero in the process of applying pressure against it. So A free float tube has very little to do with the actual mechanical accuracy of the gun and a lot to do with the practical accuracy of the gun when you're applying pressure to it in certain types of applications, rests, positions. Is it essential? No. But when you're on the clock and you want to put the gun and pin it down on a barricade, you know that with a free float tube you can apply pressure and you're not going to affect your zero or mess with your general harmonics. And that's the real purpose for a free float tube. I hope that makes sense. London Jolly. Well, actually here in Arizona should be London Yolly. Anyways, what are your thoughts on running a chest rig over a slick plate carrier? I actually like that a lot. When you have a dedicated armor configuration that has all of your stuff on it, it's dedicated. It's set up for the gun and system you're using right now. And now for most people, obviously in true military practical applications, that doesn't matter because they're not changing their guns out like we do. They're not going from a M1 to a Garand to a G43 to something else like we do on in-range. But generally speaking, and actually my Finnish plate carrier has the ability to, it's zippered, which might be a reliability issue, but hasn't been so far. Take the zipper off and you can pull a panel off and change stuff out. And that's kind of the same sort of thing you're getting from a slick plate carrier, but without having to change the actual load-bearing vest. But just having a plate carrier and then putting a load-bearing vest, or excuse me, a chest rig on top of that is a really comfortable thing to do. And you can take the chest rig on or off or whatever, and it's really a neat config. And I think that for most people, it's probably a really good solution to the problem. Jon G. As in-range continues to evolve, what's been the most surprising development? Whew. There's a lot of ways to answer this one. I think some of the mud tests, in a couple ways. One, I never expected them to be as popular as they are. When we did the first mud test, they were truly a G Willy kind of thing. It was like, let's do this. Seems like an interesting idea. And then the first mud test we did, the AK, it's at, I think, 5 million views or something. It's kind of absurd. And mud tests have consistently been one of the most popular pieces of content on the channel. That surprises me. Never expected that. The other thing that I think is probably really surprising is how incredible, frankly, the audience has been to in-range demonetizing itself proactively and going to a completely viewer-supported only economic model. So that means that only viewers fund us via Patreon. Maybe someday we'll have other divergent funding sources besides just Patreon, but we have no advertising money from any advertisers or sponsors, and it's strictly viewer-supported, like in a PBS-type model. And I think the fact that the audience has come through in such an incredible way to keep in-range alive has been incredibly surprising. And it was a real risk and a real gamble and really scary. And I'm extremely humbled and happy and thrilled that we have the audience that we have that's been so incredibly supportive and consistently so. So I think that's probably the most surprising thing and the most incredible experience that we've had with this. It's also, sadly, it's also become that in-range was never intended to become a fight against internet demonetization, censorship, and all the things going on with social media. But I don't know how you cannot address that problem as a marginalized content creator in the world we're living in 2019. So bringing InfoSec information to the channel as well has been part of that, which wasn't initially a goal, but felt almost imperative. Nick N. What is your opinion of the BRN 180 so far? I don't know if you've seen my reviews that are on the channel already about it. I love it. I think the BRN 180 is fantastic. In fact, I like it better than the HK 416 or MR 556. It's lighter, easier to deal with. It has, frankly, it feels like less recoil even with the mass. The only caveat are there are some issues with at least the first runs of them, that if you were to apply magazine pressure like monopotting, this is one of the rare instances in which you can cause a malfunction because there was not a magazine over insertion stop in the original builds. I think that's being dealt with, but if you're on a bipod or whatever, or not applying pressure to the magazine by monopotting, the BRN 180 has been wonderful. It's been reliable, really great recoil impulse, accurate, fantastic. It's one of the best piston AR-15 things on the market as far as I'm concerned, and I actually legitimately have an MR 556 and a BRN 180, and I would take the BRN 180 in a heartbeat over the HK. And I'm not saying that because of Brownells, even though we have a great relationship with them. I'm saying that because I legitimately mean that. I really like it. Josh W. How well do you think VR will work as a cost-effective way to train firearm manipulation and or pilots or anything similar? I don't think VR will work as a good way to train firearm manipulation. I think VR would be a very good way, and is a very good way, even with stuff that even entertainment titles like Onward right now, to do tactical training, tactics training, squad, communication, movement, fire suppression, has nothing, very little to do with the actual firearm manipulation. If you were to include a physical object that was in the VR so that you could control an AR-15 with standard AR-15 controls that reflected what happened in the virtual reality environment, that would help. Currently are using controllers that do not reflect the gun you're using, and therefore they are only examples of the firearm itself and not the actual manipulation that's real. So, for example, you would swipe on something to like take the safety off. You're not actually doing something that would be the exact equivalent of taking the safety off of an AR-15. However, VR for things like piloting and helicopters and crafts and driving vehicles, and I think there's a huge possibility there, and we already see it happening. There are simulations right now. I have one with the UH-1 Huey, which, oh my gosh, it is incredibly in-depth. You get in there, you get to the point where you're literally flipping switches, where the switches are, and learning the layout of the control panel, and learning how to use the collective in a way that's very, very representative of the real thing. And I honestly believe this, and I know that this would be a hard thing to test. I think if someone spent enough time in that UH-1 Huey simulator, I postulate that with enough effort, you could put them in the real thing and they could probably take off and land successfully. So I think VR is going to be hugely effective for things like that. I do not think it's going to be very effective for firearm manipulation, but it will be very effective for tactical training. Nathan F. Is a heavy trigger an acceptable, practical, and usable form of a safety? No. No, it is not. A heavy trigger is something that and it depends on what you define by heavy. Military application triggers, they typically want what we consider in civilian and competitive circles heavy, because they want to ensure that the person pulling the trigger intends to pull the trigger when they intend to pull it. But there should still be a safety and association with it, because even a heavy trigger can be inadvertently or accidentally pulled through any type of fire, movement, manipulation, falling, accidents, having your finger on the trigger when you shouldn't and you're falling. Things like that are when the safety still applies. The heavy trigger only does two things. One, it makes sure that you're very deliberate when you're actually intending to fire the gun, that you're firing it on purpose. And two, make sure that your accuracy goes down the tunnel, into the hole. Heavy triggers are the most difficult thing to fight with to getting shots on target accurately. The best upgrade you can do to any gun is to improve the trigger pull, besides skill. And so when you see things like in New York with these New York triggers, all they're really doing is impairing the ability of the person to be able to successfully hit what they need to hit when they need to hit it, causing errant rounds to be discharged in the process. And I'm sure there's a middle ground between what's heavy enough and what's too heavy, but heavy triggers are not a replacement for a safety. Not at all. Andrew M. What are your opinions on PDW stocks for AR-15s? Do they have any practical value, or are they just a gimmick? Well, these things exist in this very strange pistol loophole that exists with the ATF right now, right? So the idea is you get an AR-15 that is a pistol with what would have been a short-barreled rifle-length barrel, put a pistol stock on it, a brace, and therefore you can use a pistol in lieu of a short-barreled rifle. And there's been a back and forth about the legality of shouldering it, not shouldering it. Functionally, they're fine. There's nothing gimmicky about it. They work just fine. And if this short-barreled rifle loophole, for lack of a better term, continues to be approved and allowed, then they are absolutely not a gimmick, and they are a comfortable way to use a short-barreled rifle without going through the NFA process for a $200 tax stamp. That's it. So are they a gimmick? Nope. Do they work? Yep. Do they have practical value? Absolutely. They're just in the legal gray area, and I don't know if that'll ever get clarified. So what you think of that legal gray area is up to you. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV, but they do work. Kris C. If there was a unified attempt to ban 3D printed firearms, how do you think Americans would act in general? They would act the way that Americans have acted in general with all sorts of things to ban. Suddenly there would be a lot more interest in 3D printing and trying to print 3D firearms. The minute they try to ban the ability to print a 3D printed part or component, there will be a clamor and a huge movement to make sure that everyone possibly can print them. Americans don't react to bans well in general. There'll always be some people that won't, that'll just be like, oh, okay. But in general, banning things causes an uptick in interest, not a downtick, and there'll be a lot more 3D printed firearms than there ever was before they banned them. That's what I think would happen. JC, is there a Maxim 9 in inventory, and or will there be a follow-up with it, perhaps in a 2-gun setting? No. I wish there was. I do not have a Maxim 9 in my inventory. I think it's a really interesting, compelling, integrated, suppressed pistol, and I argued at one point, and I have not been able to use one in practical use to say this is a good statement or not, but it or something like it should be the standard issue pistol for all law enforcement, because there's no reason for law enforcement to not have a suppressed gun ready at their call. And really civilians as well. I'm just saying that it would be an excellent duty weapon type concept. I hope that makes sense. I'm not saying civilians or cops. I'm saying it's an excellent duty weapon concept, and the Maxim 9 appeared to be one that would reflect that. I've heard bad things about the trigger. The ones I felt weren't great, but they weren't bad. I don't know. I would like to have a follow-up with it in a 2-gun setting, but quite honestly, the giant pain in the ass of the NFA and the 1-year wait to get the tax stamp has caused me to focus on other projects for in-range, and the Maxim 9 is not one on the list or the radar, and it's strictly just that nonsense that I hate dealing with. So, would love to do it someday, and maybe. Germi, is the Browning high power obsolete? Why or why not? I would call it obsolescent, not obsolete. It is definitely less obsolete than the 1911. It is higher capacity. It's 9mm with low recoil. I do not care for the magazine safety. Of course, you can get them without that or can remove it. It has a good trigger pull. It's a reliable, good design. It was definitely an improvement over the 1911, and it was where Browning was going, and for good reasons. It was the future. Now, is it obsolescent? Yes. It's lower capacity than modern equivalent polymer handguns. It weighs more than a polymer handgun. And as a result, the weight and the capacity would make it obsolescent, but it is not obsolete. Tim B, do you have to have a special license to have weapons shipped for videos, or are they just borrowed from local owners for length of time to film? Well, that's a really interesting way to put that, Tim. You said local owners. Here in Arizona, if the person I am borrowing, if a person is here in Arizona and they are an Arizona citizen, or they're here in Arizona, they come to visit, and it's not an NFA controlled item such as a short-barreled rifle, short-barreled shotgun, or machine gun, they can just loan it to me. There's no legality issue with that if they're here loaning it to me at the time. If they're an Arizona resident, they can just give it to me. Literally, we have private party transfer here where I'm like, you want this gun? And yeah, and if they're not a prohibited possessor and they're an Arizona resident, there it is. We can trade guns. So if they're borrowed from a local Arizona person or someone visiting Arizona, there is no legality issues with that. If they are from out of state and not able to bring it here locally, then it needs to go through a FFL transfer process where they would ship it from their FFL to my FFL, and then I would get it from the FFL through a standard 4473 background check, do the videos with it, and then ship it back to them through kind of the same process. So it's a kind of a pain in the butt, but it happens, and when there's guns unique enough that we can't get otherwise, that's the process we use. Tim K, what cartridge do you think is tragically overlooked? I don't know if tragically is the right word, but I think two that come to mind are from World War II, 6.5 Swede and 6.5 Japanese, or JIC 6.5 Arasaka. Both of them are extremely good cartridges, extremely good ballistics, really good ballistic coefficient, low recoil, low noise, easy to handle, accurate rounds, and 6.5 has been a sweet spot forever, and the Swedes and the Japanese got it right. And I know the Japanese went to 7.7 later, but that's a whole other discussion. But those are both art cartridges that should have been looked at closer post-war for development purposes. So I don't know if they were tragically overlooked, but I don't think that they got the merit they deserved. Alan, I like the dust tests as a complement to the mud tests. How do you think open bolt machine guns like the PKM would fare? They'll die immediately. Anything open bolt will fail probably. I don't know that it would get off one round, never mind more than one. Open bolt is, by the nature of an open bolt, a giant gaping hole in the gun, willing to accept dirt, mud, or any other debris that can get in it. We have not tested any open bolt guns because I frankly consider it a fool's errand. They're just going to fail immediately. So I think the PKM would die. I think any open bolt stuff is extremely unlikely to do well. Now, I can give you an exception to that. If you look back, there are historical videos about the Owen submachine gun where they blow sand and dust on them. That was an interesting design in the way that they designed around the open bolt. It did really well. So my opinion is most open bolt, if not all of them, will generally do pretty badly. Brock F. Are there any airfields or municipal airports near 2G ACM? Well, Brock, I assume you're talking about the monthly two-gun action challenge match that we run north of Tucson, technically in Catalina, Arizona. Yeah, there are. There's a number of them. There's the Tucson Airport. There's the Marana International Airport, which I don't know why they would call that international, but I think it is international. But anyways, there's the Marana Airport, and both of those are relatively close to where we run the two-gun action challenge match. And what I mean by close, a 45-minute drive from the range. If you're planning to fly in here to shoot a match, I do want to warn you though that we only accept registrations via practice score, and they get filled up super duper fast. When the match goes live, generally in the first week of the month, it is full within 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes within a day. So make sure you have a seat at the match if you're going to fly out here to shoot the match, because we don't want you to come out here and then be turned away. That would suck. Denver S. Am I wrong for loving synthetic motor oil and wheel bearing grease for gun lubricants? I don't think you are. I don't think this stuff matters that much. This is one of those things, and I don't like getting into the whole gun oil thing because it becomes religion. It's weird. People are really weird about gun oil, and they're really weird about knives, and they're really weird about lumens and flashlights. And those three topics are just awful. They're just tainted with poison. And I don't know why. But the reality is any mechanical lubricant that makes your gun continue to run is fine by me. Some of them might have some after effects. Some of them gum up, especially if they're made from non-toxic or vegetable oil type ingredients. Ate some of that on the channel once, and it works fine as a mechanical lubricant until it gums up and becomes glue, but that's another discussion. That said, synthetic motor oil and wheel bearing grease works just fine. My typical lubricant on my guns is whatever happens to be nearby or whatever I got free from the last match or gun show that I went to. I don't really care whatsoever what it is. I put it on there, it runs the gun. You can always wipe it off and put something else on. In a pinch, when I forgot oil and I had a finicky old gun, some classic thing out in the desert, I just use the dipstick off my gun and get oil out of my engine and put it on the gun. And that works great too, even dirty old engine oil from a Volkswagen. So this is something I think we overthink a lot, and we need to underthink it and just use generally good quality synthetic oils or non-synthetics if that's your preference. The only thing I do standardize on for my old guns and for cleaning corrosive ammo and black powder is Ballistol, which is kind of magic in its own right. It's a great cleaning lubricant. It's a great cleaning fluid. It is non-toxic, but it's not the best lubricant. It's like this weird thing that kind of does everything, but it doesn't do any of it perfect, except for cleaning out corrosive salts, which is very good at. So, but in terms of synthetic motor oil, I don't care. I say go for it. If it works for you, I don't see a problem with it. I've used it, and I'm not trying to say it works for me. I've used it myself, and it works fine, and most of this stuff works fine, and dedicated gun oils mostly work fine, and all of this is something that we're crazy about, and this idea that there's some magic oil that does some magic thing is nonsense. We've talked about it here on the In-Range. Nothing's magic, and a mechanical oil for your car isn't all that different than the mechanical parts for your gun. Christopher H. Third time question. Sorry, Chris. What are the best oiled wood and blued steel firearms for 2G ACM? You're going to be surprised when I answer this one. There's two that come to mind right off the bat. If you're going classic, the M1 Garand. Can't go wrong with it. That gun's still great. Is it obsolescent? Yeah, absolutely. It's still effective? Yeah, absolutely. Is it a big hunk of steel and wood? Yup. And man, it's accurate, reliable, and easy to use. That's great. The other one I'm going to go with is going to be the one that's going to surprise people, the Mini 14 and Mini 30. That gun gets a lot of drift, and people are like hate on it. And frankly, as long as you've got good quality Ruger magazines, the guns are reliable, they're accurate, and they work. And they are steel and wood. So I would recommend an M1 Garand or a Mini 14 or Mini 30. Mini 14 is my preference between the two of those. Those two work really great. Mark B. How challenging is it to do a multi-channel collaboration like Finnish Brutality, and how much do you know everyone beforehand? Challenging? Very challenging. You got to coordinate a lot. So in that, we produced videos that landed up going on every channel. We had to have schedules to make sure we didn't put out a stage before another stage, and that we didn't put out redundant content, and we had to get a lot of coordination done with one another. So if in terms of actually doing the collaboration and actually getting the content scheduled and edited and coordinated, it's very challenging. How challenging is it to work with people like Ziga and Mike from Bloke on the Range, or Ziga from Polymer R Tactical? Not at all. Those guys are awesome. First time I met either of them, I had talked to them. Well, I had met Ziga at like SHOT Show, like really short little hi, how you doing kind of stuff, but hadn't really hung out with them. And I've talked to Mike a couple of times, but hadn't been with him in person. And filming with Ziga and Mike was absolutely a pleasure. They were so fun to shoot with, such cool guys. The actual conversations flowed like water. It was a piece of cake to work with them. And of course, I already knew all the Finns from Varstaleka and Jari and all that, so they're my friends. That was easy as well. So the coordination part, hard. The actual conversation and shooting the match with them, a pleasure. More fun than doing it solo. So hopefully we're going to see more of that in the future. I think all of them are coming out for Desert Brutality 2020, by the way. Martin M. What fictional, movie, video game, etc. guns would you like to own in real life? Well, that's easy for me. The M41A pulse rifle from Aliens and the M56 smart gun, also from Aliens. I don't know if you can tell, or if you really know, if you're an in-range viewer, that I'm a huge Aliens fan of the whole franchise. Now, not the fourth one. That's garbage. And the third one's not garbage. Alien 3 from David Fincher is not garbage. It's actually a really good film if you see the special edition director's cut. Do not watch the theatrical cut. They ruined it. They cut almost an hour or more out of the movie, completely ruined the film. But if you see the director's cut, the special edition, Alien 3 is really good. But anyways, I would go with the M41A pulse rifle and the M56 smart gun. I can't think of anything else that I want more than that. And you know, Richard Lage of Lage Manufacturing makes a conversion for the M11 submachine gun, turns it into an M41 pulse rifle. And he's got, I think, one or two of them that he made for himself, but he won't make any more of them. And oh my gosh, I'd want one of those for mine. So Richard, if you're listening, please, anything. What can we do to make an M41 pulse rifle from in-range? I would love it. But those are the ones that I would want. Lewis B. I know that the WWSD carbine went with the 14.5-inch barrel with permanently attached flash suppressor due to U.S. federal law. If these constraints were not applicable, would you have gone with a shorter barrel? So what Lewis is describing here is that anything shorter than a 16-inch barrel is a violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, become a short barrel rifle. So what you need to do if you have a 14.5-inch barrel is you put on something slightly longer, like a 2-inch long flash hider, which gives you an overall length of 16 inches, etc. And that gets you, but you have to permanently affix it by welding it on and pinning it. Would I have gone with a shorter barrel if it wasn't for the NFA? No, I wouldn't. I would not have wanted to give up the velocity and ballistic effects that 14.5-inch barrels still bring to the table. And as well as when you go below that barrel length on a DIAR, gas systems get a little weird. What I would have done, though, was not have a permanently affixed flash hider. I would have had some detachable muzzle device for suppressors, etc. So I would have stuck with the same barrel length. I just would have not had the permanently welded-on pinned flash hider. Brian I. Karl, have you ever tried airsoft or paintball? If so, how did it compare to competition shooting? Yes, I've not done airsoft. I've done quite a bit of paintball and enjoyed it very much. Paintball is really interesting from a perspective of communication, tactics, squad stuff, if you're with some switched on guys or people. And it's fun, therefore, from a perspective of tactics and communication and fire and movement. How does it compare to competition shooting? Not at all. 0%. Competition shooting and that have nothing in common. Competition shooting typically, unless it's a very special environment, does not give you squad level tactics and communication, but do give you practical real world firearms handling skills and marksmanship under stress. Paintball gives you no real practical real world marksmanship or firearms handling under stress, but does give you tactics, squad level communication, etc. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. I would say you could do both and garner both of those to a large degree, but they have paintball has very little to do with competition shooting. And airsoft, I've fired a lot of airsoft guns. Those aren't all that different either in that regard. Michael O. Olympic 22 caliber rifle and dynamic shooting. How many transferable skills are there between the two? Well, there is a huge transferable skill, which are the fundamentals. When you shoot either NRA high power or one of these very disciplined disciplines, Olympic 22 caliber rifle or air rifle being absolutely a very disciplined marksmanship oriented sport, the skills you acquire in that skill set, such as the ability to breath control, precision, natural point of aim, bone support over muscling the gun, those things absolutely apply to dynamic shooting events. So if you have the fundamentals down and you have a true control of marksmanship over yourself and your own ability to do it, then doing that under stress in dynamic shooting will come even easier. Mike from Bloke on the Range recently did really well at Finnish Brutality 2019, and I know most of his shooting is not the dynamic shooting, but the marksmanship that he has from all of his disciplined shooting disciplines came through when he used an FAL at Finnish Brutality very effectively on the clock. Lewis R. Do you foresee any changes coming to handguns that will make the 1911 obsolete? Yeah, the Browning high power made the Browning 1911 obsolete. In my opinion, the 1911 was obsolete quite a long time ago. Just because we still use it and it can still kill people and still is reliable and works for the most part, reliable if you have a good one, is fine. But you could say the same thing about a single action army 5-shot Colt revolver, right? I mean, they are obsolete. The 1911 is obsolete based on the cartridge that it fires, the recoil impulse, and the capacity. So, are there any handguns coming that will make the 1911 obsolete? Yes, the Browning high power made it obsolete, what, 1935? So it's been obsolete for a long time. Gabriel C. Would you recommend focusing more on physical fitness or shooting proficiency for a match like Desert Brutality? Well, neither of the above right off the bat. If you're not a competitive shooter yet, I would focus on safe gun handling under time stress. And that should be done somewhere other than Desert Brutality or Finnish Brutality. I would not recommend going to Desert Brutality with absolutely no competition experience under your belt. Will be a bad thing, honestly. It will be very hard for you to stay through the event and not getting DQ'd. It's possible, but very hard. If you've got that part already handled, would I focus more on physical fitness or shooting proficiency? I would say that I would focus on cardio, which is something I absolutely need to do more of myself. But the cardio element at Desert Brutality is always probably one of the biggest challenges. And I think that we know that it's a shooting match because we see people that have the shooting are incredible shooters that maybe aren't physically as capable and still they're winning the match. So it is ultimately a shooting match, but in my opinion, the physical fitness part matters a lot. Jon B. Are you and Ian going to Red October this year? Well, we know that this Q&A was delayed, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, because it is being distributed at the end of October. And it actually, Red October just finished being shot. And no, neither of us were going to attend Red October this year. And we were not there. So there's your answer. You probably already know that if you're watching this now and we're paying attention. Herk, please explain the best technique for kettlebell throwing a la the Casarda drill. I'd like to practice for brutality matches while ingraining inefficient technique or worse, getting injured. The best technique for this is to look into doing a traditional kettlebell swing, which is essentially, it is a weight-based exercise that includes a squat and where the kettlebell goes between the legs and you squat and bring it up and you just keep swinging it back and forth. That's timed with a squat and the swing of the kettlebell. The difference between a kettlebell swing and a kettlebell throw at a Casarda drill is that in a swing you don't let it go. So I happen to have like a kind of push thing where I push it off as I throw it. That's something you could practice with. Some people think that's useful, some people do not. But the best thing you can do to practice kettlebell throwing is, first of all, use a light kettlebell. Don't start with an extraordinarily heavy one. Ramp up and practice a traditional exercise-oriented kettlebell swing without the throw. Once you're comfortable with that, then start throwing. If you want, then increase the weight. Jon W. In 2 or 3 gun matches, have you ever tried shooting from kneeling versus going prone when possible? Yeah, and I'll tell you what, this is interesting. I actually shoot worse kneeling than I do offhand. Offhand is just standing. Kneeling for me is a bad position. I've never gotten very stable from kneeling. Now there's reasons for kneeling, and you can use kneeling as a marksmanship position, especially if you do it right with a sling and bone support. But in high power, for example, you can kneel or go seated, and no one does kneeling because seated is far more precise and reliable and consistent than kneeling. But I do not, and prone is even more consistent with more body on the ground than seated, and therefore kneeling. So as much contact as you can have with the ground and the least amount of bone support you have to use to keep the gun on with your natural point of aim, the better. Prone is better than sitting. Sitting is better than kneeling. And theoretically, kneeling is better than offhand, but I frankly find offhand to be better, and I've had more practice with offhand. So generally speaking, unless kneeling is required tactically in a training environment or at a match, I don't use it. Bunny. How concerned do I need to be about the wiggle between an AR upper and lower, and how would you fix it? For the most part, unless it's excessive to the point where it's causing problems, you don't need to worry about it at all. That wiggle will not actually cause accuracy issues, and at least not from my experience, and I've even had wiggle in my precision high power gun that I was using to garner points in excellence in competition matches. I do not think it's an issue, and people get really fixated on it, but it's not something to worry about. If you want to fix it, there's a really simple fix. There's a little rubber thing you can get, I think, on Brownells or Midway, called an AccuWedge, AccuWedge. It's just a little red thing with a tab, and you stick it below, in the lower, right behind the lower, the takedown pin at the rear of the lower. And then when you push the upper, it kind of compresses this little rubber AccuWedge, and you have to really use, it's a tight fit, and then usually rubber mallet the lower pin, or the pin through the upper to lock the upper and lower receiver together. And that will absolutely remove all, if not almost all, of the wiggle between your upper and lower. But generally speaking, it's not an issue, it's not something to worry about, and it's something people get really fixated on when they don't need to be. That's all the questions that we have right now. Now, there were more questions in this, but this is all we could really get through this month. Hopefully we'll have Ian back for Q&A next month. He's in Narnia right now. But guys, if you like this kind of stuff, once again, please consider supporting us on Patreon. These questions all come from incredible Patreon supporters. But if you can't, I do understand. Please subscribe with one of our multiple distribution points. You can find them all on inrange.tv and share with your friends. Thank you very much.